Well, a committee of Europeans over in Brussels regulating the internet. What could go wrong? I mean, it sounds like one of the dumbest ideas in a part of the world which I love and value, but hasn't done a lot for innovation.
This is Paul Johnson with The Optimistic American. Now, I say in the front of almost every show that we exist to try and help renew the American spirit. In that light, today we have a new product that we're announcing. We haven't named it yet. It's a product that's going to have 4 or 5 people on a show, and we're going to talk about current events. This first one has a panel of people that I'm very good friends with. It has Governor Doug Ducey, the past governor of Arizona, Elliot Pollack, who's one of our nation's better economists, and Carson Holmquist, who is an entrepreneur and who's doing amazing things in the trucking and housing industry. What's going to be fun about this is that we're going to have a deep well of people to go to talk about geopolitical issues, political issues, as well as economic issues. I'm interested in your input. So if you would, leave comments. Tell us what it is that you think about the things that we're saying, whether or not you like the new format and what we're doing. If you see something that we're doing wrong on it, as opposed to the content, you can give us comments on the content as well. But in terms of the format, we'd love to hear your input. And then we're also interested in what your thoughts might be for our name. We're going to name this over the next 4 or 5 days. It'll be a part of the Optimistic American programming, but we're going to have a unique name for it. Now, I know I'm going to regret having asked for the names because I'm probably going to get some things that are going to be a little insulting, but that's okay too. In any event, I think you're going to enjoy this show. Thanks for being here with us today. And now on with our panel. All right, first, I'd like to welcome all of my guests here today. It's fun to have this panel. We're going to talk about a variety of different issues. We're certainly going to put a big focus on free enterprise and what's happening, how regulations can have a big effect on businesses and companies. We're going to talk about housing policy. We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about social media and how regulations affect them. And last, we're going to get a little bit of input on what's going on with the economy. But what I'll do here is I'm going to start with Carson. Carson Holmquist has a company that has been involved in the trucking industry and the housing industry. Carson, welcome today to our show.
Thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. And then Elliot Pollack. Elliot is really a treasure for Arizona. He's an economist. I think he's one of the best in the country. He also was, for me, a very important advisor. I had to go through a pretty tough recession during the time that I was mayor, and Elliot played a huge role in giving me advice, although he might deny it every now and then. We'll see. But nonetheless, Elliot, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
All right, and last, this is kind of a strange bedfellow for me. Governor Ducey and I have been friends for a long time. Governor Ducey is a Republican. I was a Democratic mayor, but I'm an independent today. I will tell you, I think Governor Ducey is one of the best governors that the state of Arizona ever had. Maybe one, well, he was voted in by other governors across the country to represent them. He's exceptional at what he does. We're very proud to have him here today. The question I'm going to ask you, Doug, is you're running the Citizens for a Free Enterprise. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that entity and what it is that you're doing?
Well, first I want to say thank you, Paul. It's great to be here with you on my first ever televised podcast post-office. And I'm thrilled to have Elliot as well, who I relied on a lot of his economic opinion and data over the 8 years in office. And Carson, I'm looking forward to getting to know you. For the record, today is Game 5 of the Diamondbacks series in the World Series against the Texas Rangers. I don't know when this will view, but that's why I'm in this garb today, because I'm excited. And when we're done, I'm going to head over to Chase Field. So I consider you a friend as well, Paul. And as I was entering public life, I think you were on the other side of my first race, and we broke bread after that, and you gave me some good advice and counsel, and I've tried to use it to the best of my ability to serve the people of Arizona. Today, I'm out of office and I'm leading up an organization called Citizens for Free Enterprise. And we are going to educate and advocate for free enterprise in all 50 states. And we're also going to work to register and activate new voters. We wanted to choose an evergreen principle that isn't talked about that much. Usually we're on one side or the other of the culture wars, and many of those discussions are important. I participated in that, but they change nearly every cycle. One thing that doesn't change is the prosperity of Americans. And most people will tell you that they vote from their pocketbook. You know, if you held a sign that said capitalism and socialism in today's college classrooms, it'd be about a 50-50 proposition. I think that should terrify everyone listening. We talk a lot about freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly, all very important freedoms. But all of these are undergirded by economic freedom, which has allowed us to have the most powerful military in the history of the world and to be significant geopolitically and economically all around the globe. And this is something we hope to advance from Citizens for Free Enterprise.
All right. So one of the things that I was deeply interested in was your, if you go to your website, it talks about regulatory overreach or governmental overreach. Talk about that. What's the concern that the Citizens for a Free Enterprise have in that regard?
Well, Paul, I think when we first met, you knew me as an ice cream salesman. My company was Cold Stone Creamery. It was founded right here in the state of Arizona on the southwest corner of Southern and McClintock. We grew it to 1,440 stores in all 50 states. Today, it operates in 31 countries around the world. I sold Cold Stone in 2007, but I can't think of a better primer for an aspiring governor to know what different policies across the country can affect the small businessman and the entrepreneur. And I think I developed my diplomatic skills working with a health instructor in California on the day of open, because that individual often has the power of life and death over an entry-level entrepreneur who's put their life savings into one of these new businesses. In Arizona, even with the power of the governor's office and the talented team I had, it took about 18 months to get our arms around all the regulations that we have in the state of Arizona. And I think most people that have been in business know that regulation can be a hidden tax. And of course, some regulation is important. We want to drive on the right side of the road. We want to make sure that we're, stopping at traffic lights. We also want to protect the consumer, and we want to protect public health. But much of regulation can be passed to protect incumbent interests or to build a moat against innovators that want to bring change to a marketplace. We were able to, over my time in office, actually erase from the books over 3,000 regulations. I think it was the equivalent of a $180 million tax cut without costing the general fund $1, and you're able to enjoy that benefit each year. So I think we want to live in a prosperous and safe environment, but we also have to understand what happens down at state capitals, what happens among boards and commissions, and what happens with special incumbent interests. And oftentimes they try to build up obstacles to keep competition away. And that's why we wanted to reduce unnecessary regulations.
All right. So this question is going to go over to Elliot. Elliot, you and I both love to read. We had a book that we read called Why Nations Fail. That particular book, I thought one of the great examples that Doug's talking about was the king or the emperor of Venice, when he talked about in the book. Professor Robinson, by the way, has been on this show. He and his partner really wrote a great book. But he talked about this king of Venice who had an individual who came forward and said, hey, I've come up with an invention that has unbreakable glass. And the point that he made was that the king of Venice, of course, had become so powerful because glass was being used in everything. It was being used in fishing nets. It was being used in churches. And it made Venice a very powerful place. Well, he asked the guy who had put together the product, he says, okay, have you told anybody else? He said, no. He says, told your wife or anyone else? He says, no, I haven't told anyone else. The king immediately killed him, right? And he killed him because he said, why do I want unbreakable glass? I've made a kingdom based upon glass that doesn't break. Now, of course, the point that Professor Robinson makes is that Venice eventually falls, but it falls because they lost the edge on technology. They lost the ability to be in the lead of it. Maybe if you could talk about that concept from an economic standpoint.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, regulation, as the governor put it, should be limited to those things that are absolutely necessary. The problem with regulation now is it goes into many things that would be better handled and better decided by the private sector. And the problem there is that government is not very efficient. The great thing about the market system is every day what people think of your product or any other product because they go out and take their dollars and they vote every day. And the ones that are successful do well. The ones that aren't successful go away and those resources are reallocated. Government doesn't care about any of that. They always have some first to protect people, but they overprotect people, and then they do things as to exacerbate problems for political reasons, because cronyism when you get down to it. So essentially, the more government you have, the less efficient your overall system is going to be, by definition. And by the way, you said about going to a class and saying capitalism or socialism and see what people say. I dare anybody to show me one example of an economy that lasted an extended period of time that created nearly the wealth for its entire population that capitalism has. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist because what happens is when you have the government picking winners and losers, they invariably pick losers. Why? Because they're cronies. It doesn't work. Take Solyndra, for example. Is a classic example. But you never pick winners or losers. You never stop the private sector from doing the things that will enhance its ability to create wealth for everyone. And when a society does that, when it becomes more and more bureaucratic, more and more regulation, more and more decided by people who not only don't understand the economic system but couldn't care less, eventually that system falls. And I'll point out one other thing. You might have seen this on the internet. Apparently there was an interview of the guy who founded one of the Emirates, and essentially what he said, and it was an inane question that brought this on. It was about what kind of car do you drive? And he said, well, I drive a Rolls. My grandfather basically was on a Camel. My kid will drive a Range Rover. His kid will drive a Range Rover. His kid will ride a Camel. And he said something that I found obvious, but very, very interesting. He said, your grandfathers basically stormed Normandy Beach at 18 to save the world. They lived through the Depression. And he said that tough times create tough people. Tough people create good times. Good times create soft people. Soft people create bad times. And it's just a cycle like that, 3 or 4 generation cycle. And I don't have to tell anybody on this call where we stand in that cycle. And that, by the way, scares the heck out of me, especially with what's going on in the world today. You need, and even FDR. FDR was the New Deal president until the beginning of World War II. Then he became the win the war president. And he won the war by turning over all production to the private sector. And there's a book called the Arsenal of Freedom, where he basically, the author describes how the private sector basically, we simply outproduced our adversaries. It's that simple. That doesn't happen if the government is in charge, because they're not making market-based decisions. They're making decisions that have nothing to do with the long-term outlook of a situation. And so where do we stand? Well, hopefully this is just the pendulum swinging to one side and it swings back to the other side. but it's going to be ugly while it swings the other way. And hopefully it's temporary and not permanent, but you basically need less regulation of things that are better handled by a market system.
All right, Carson, you spent a lot of time as an entrepreneur. You, in fact, work with lots of entrepreneurs also. You and I have had lots of conversations about what the governor touched on briefly, which is this whole idea of regulatory capture. Give me kind of, as an entrepreneur, your view of that concept and the problems with it.
Well, what happens is, let me start with real estate. Okay, real estate. You have to go through an extended process. In fact, the cost of regulation amounts to about 30% of the cost of a house. 30%, think of that, is because of regulation. So cities go out and they hire planners. That's great, except these planners are taught in schools of liberal arts or schools of architecture. They don't have any background on how economies work. They have no idea of what they're going to do, how what they're going to do is affect the economy as a whole or the users of the product, in this case housing, nor do they care. Well, that's a slippery slope. So when they have a chance to add more regulations like the color of a house or setbacks or this other stuff, they go for it. And all it does is add to cost without basically helping the system. Their job should be to make sure that people aren't doing things that create monopolies, doing things that are not disclosed. But once you basically don't create monopolies and all your information is disclosed, it's up to the consumer to make the decision. And that's becoming more and more difficult. It is. I'll give you my father's example. My father was born in Russia in 1903. Okay. And he came over, he went through ninth grade, dropped out, and he opened an auto body shop that he owned until he was 65. He couldn't do that today. He'd never get past the regulations. He'd never have the money to do it because then you could just show up on a street corner, get a building and start. You can't do that anymore. The cost of regulation has become an impediment to starting businesses, an impediment to the ongoing costs of businesses. I could point out example after example, but that generality is what I come away with. And again, I've owned and operated several businesses in my life. I've seen literally thousands because of what I do as an economist. But it's becoming more and more difficult. And when people talk about the American dream is more difficult to achieve, mainly because not of what's going on in the marketplace, but by how regulation affects the marketplace.
Carson, you want to give me input on how you see that?
Yeah. My perspective is a business owner. I certainly don't have the experience of all three of you, but from my perspective as a business owner, I do believe the American dream is still alive and well. I still think generally business is still a marketplace of innovation and value creation for the most part, but certainly regulation gets in the way. Our business provides transportation specifically to a very niche industry, which is the modular construction industry, a new modern method of constructing buildings. And I get an opportunity to work with these founding entrepreneurs who are building these factories and essentially building components of a building inside a factory. It's a pretty amazing process. And they do often talk about regulation as obstacles. It's very common for a large incumbent supplier, a material supplier in the construction industry, to set new code standards based off of their own products, which basically guarantees them business based off of code demands. And in an environment like building in a factory, what you want is to have a plethora of material options and methodologies, so you can redefine what it is to build something in a more efficient way. There's certainly obstacles in the way, specifically in the housing industry. And I think, Governor Ducey, you brought up, when regulation, there's a place for regulation, but when it is serving the interests of incumbents and incumbents only and keeping out new competition, obviously it's gone too far. And I I think that's very common in very old industries where the incumbents are very powerful. It's very commonplace to see.
Almost every regulation that I saw in being mayor, there was always an incumbent that was a part of the process driving it. And of course, that doesn't mean they necessarily started the regulation, but once they knew that government was moving in that direction, they have lobbyists, people who are engaged, and they then began to maneuver it so that it would be helpful to them, or at least less harmful to their business, but harmful in that it would cut out other people from being able to compete. One of the issues, and Governor, I'm going to go back to you on this one. What I see is that let's just use Steve Jobs on the cell phone. I think that it's important that Steve Jobs created a cell phone. It dramatically changed the industry. And in changing the industry, I'm not sure how much he should have made. Like, should we have limited him to $1 million? Sometimes I hear people talking about how much money people make from this. My view of it is he had to be able to make as much as he can. I also believe that it's important that we not let him stop other people from being able to compete against him. Now, monopoly laws or antitrust laws are partly designed around that, but I think oftentimes people miss how regulations can play a role in that as well. Governor Ducey?
Well, I think we sometimes have too much focus on inequality, and equality is part of our creed. It's part of our commitment. Equality of opportunity, equality under the law, political equality, that I have one vote and you have one vote. But in recent years, at least since President Obama was president, there's been a lot of discussion in class warfare about the growing equality gap. And I think if you really look at the amount of dollars that the government distributes, it's not as dramatic as many on the left would tell you. And I also think the question shouldn't be so much about what the gap is, although I think we can discuss that. I think it should be, do people have enough? Do we have a strong social safety net that keeps people from falling through the cracks? I can't find any real good reason that I should be upset that Jeff Bezos is worth approximately $183 billion in change more than I am, because I'm doing okay. And I know there's other people that want to be doing well also, but I want them to be in a position where they can climb the economic ladder, where we can make sure that they don't fall through that social safety net, and get away from the discussion around just income inequality, because it's pretty easy to solve that. I can do that by making a lot of people less rich, but that doesn't really make anyone else more prosperous. So I think that's issue one. And then on the second part of this, Paul, I know you enjoy reading our founding documents, and we both have found so much wisdom and good fortune that we had these people in the 18th century that just came together and put the Declaration and Constitution and Federalist Papers, and so much of it remains timeless to this day. One thing I don't think the founders could have anticipated was the proliferation of laws and regulations. And I often said, if I had a third term, and I believe in term limits, and 2 terms was plenty. But what I would do is I would veto every law that didn't come to me without a sunset clause. Now, if it's a good law, let it be reconsidered in 5 years or 10 years. But if it's a bad law, let it expire. Let it go away, because we don't do a very good job repealing laws. We worked very, very hard and took all of 8 years to repeal the number of regulations that we had. And it should be incumbent on elected leaders. If something's necessary, make sure it stays there. But oftentimes these laws don't age well. There's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of laws on the books of all 50 states. The federal government participates in as well. The only things that I don't think should go away are our Declaration and our Constitution. If we want to change the Constitution, we can go through the amendment process. And if we left more flexibility to the states, we'd have more of what Justice Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy, and we'd let the states compete against each other. Best practices could be exported to other states, and if a state makes a bad decision, no other state has to suffer from that, and that state can repeal that law. So I think, on that type of accountability, we'd have much better government, good government, rather than our federal government trying to do way too much and doing most of it poorly.
Governor, I found that to be exactly the truth, which is, what I saw in being mayor was that we kept adding rules on top, but we didn't remove any of the old rules, any of the old laws. And the effect of that, the challenge was that it just began to become a mountain of regulations. In fact, I would argue it became so complex, especially in the building industry, the people who worked for us really couldn't tell the private sector what the rules really were. It was a huge challenge. Elliot, you were going to say something?
Well, go ahead with this thought, because I think that is a great thought, the one that the governor and you just had, that essentially it's just years and years of regulation on regulation on regulation, and it never goes away. It just gets bigger. I will say this, that on the thought of equality of opportunity versus equality of result, there is still great mobility in this question, in that 40% of the people in the bottom quintile end up in the second quintile, about 20% end up in the top quintile. Very few stay in the bottom quintile. And getting rich in America is no secret. It takes tenacity. It takes basically getting an education in something where you have a marketable skill. It takes getting married to somebody who also has the same point of view and also an education. It takes staying married. It takes basically taking care of yourself and having some luck and not getting really sick. And it takes working a lot of hours. If you take a look at how much people in the top quintile work versus the bottom quintile or the second quintile, it's day and night. People work hard. You don't get rich for nothing in this country. That is nothing but a fantasy. Same thing with the thought about Bezos or Bill Gates or any other billionaire in this country. Basically, they worked hard, but they created something that people really wanted. Nobody put a gun at their head, at a customer's head, and said, you better buy that computer that has Microsoft software. Nobody put a gun to your head when you go to Amazon. Nobody put a gun to your head when you bought ice cream from Cold Stone Creamery. People did it by choice. And the only thing that these guys are saying when they say we have to stop this is we don't like the way people are choosing. We want to make choices for them. I find that quite frankly reprehensible.
Yeah, me too. Governor, I'm going to put this question back on you, because I see this problem as being a problem on both the right and the left. And I'll give you what I mean by that. We had Robert Kennedy. I listened to Robert Kennedy give kind of his compelling reason for why he should be president. It was clear to me that everything was based upon the idea that there's this cabal or this conspiracy theory of industries, the pharma industry, the industrial military complex, big oil companies that are all out trying to harm individuals. Now, what I see that's happening is that used to be more of a left side argument, but I'm seeing on the extremes. I'm not talking about the traditional Democrat or traditional Republicans, but I'm seeing in the extremes this whole new resentment type of politics that's based more on envy as opposed to how do we make improvements. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, I've listened to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with great interest. My boys have somehow found him possibly part of the solution. So this is some of our dinner table conversation that we're having right here, Paul. And I think he's very skilled. I mean, one, he's named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think he went to Harvard Law and Yale or Harvard. So, and he sounds and looks so much like his father's, a figure that was so admired in a very special time in American history, who we tragically lost to assassination along with his uncle and Martin Luther King around the same time. I mean, when people think it can't get worse than it is today, I say, when I was a toddler, America was participating in politics of assassination, and we're not there, and hopefully we don't get there. But I do think Robert F. Kennedy, given the anecdotal evidence and even some of the recent polling that was just released today, has captured the imagination of much of the electorate. And one of his skills, in addition to ringing a nostalgic tone, is he is touching on some things that are really wrong inside our government. It wasn't all that long ago that 75% of the United States trusted our federal government, and things like Vietnam and Watergate rightly eroded much of that trust. And the things that Robert F. Kennedy points out that I agree with is what is going on with Big Pharma, the FDA, and healthcare. I'm at the age I'm fortunate enough to still have my mother and father, but they're going through different health challenges. And any of you that have participated in anything outside of just an annual physical have got to be frustrated beyond belief as to how healthcare is administered here. The fact that you don't get these tests until you're sick. We're not in the business at all of prevention. We're in the business of treatment. And what we're approving and blessing from a government standpoint in terms of our food pyramid has got people eating, getting sick, and becoming obese. And I think this is something I would really like to see addressed. I think it could be leadership out of Washington, D.C. I don't know why I'm seeing all these pharmaceutical commercials when I'm watching the Super Bowl or Sunday football. Their customer is the doctor. But in many ways, I think the reporting on what's happening around this, the reporting of why our country has become so sedentary and obese, does begin in an erosion of trust in these institutions and agencies. And that's one thing I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has gotten a lot of purchase on, because I think it makes sense to people when they look around, when they get on an airplane, when they, when they go to the grocery store.
In healthcare, and I'm going to go back to Carson here with a question in a second, but in healthcare, it's one of the most regulated industries in the country. And what I found in being in that industry is that those regulations, for the most part, protect people in the industry, but they don't do a lot to really help protect the consumer. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some regulations that are important to the consumer, but overwhelmingly, what I see is that the regulations are so difficult that it pushes people more towards using a hospital, and oftentimes using it because you don't have to pay for it. If you don't have the money to pay for a primary care visit, and you say you take your child to an emergency room with a cold, you don't have to give them a check when you get done. Now, what will end up happening is that just effectively goes back to the taxpayers. But doing things to help people on the front end is just something that regulations not only aren't addressing, but they're harming. Now, Carson, I want to flip with you if I can. You spent a lot of time on the housing issue. I know there are lots of regulations that are happening there. What I found to be interesting is in California, you have a Democratic governor who's kind of going the other way on regulations from the cities. He's actually opposing cities on housing regulations, trying to create more housing there. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing on that from an industry standpoint.
Yeah, you're right, Paul. I mean, there's such a housing shortage in California. It's very public conversation around a housing crisis. They've done a few things to address it. Famously, Assembly Bill 68, which allowed any single family resident to add 2 additional structures in their backyard. One ADU, accessory dwelling unit, up to 1,200 square feet, and then a third one, 500 square feet or less, which has really sparked the modular industry, because a lot of these are built in factories and just craned into the yard. But these are responses to unaffordable housing, the cost of things being built. So it's almost addressing a level, like a surface level for things that are fundamentally probably deeper problems in regulation that are making those environments so expensive to live in anyways. But they are doing things like there's a home key program that's really incentivizing bringing affordable multifamily projects to the market, multifamily housing program. So there's a lot of things California is doing. It's actually in some ways removing red tape to make housing more affordable, but some of that's in response to regulation that have got them into this situation seemingly. But I'd also like to go back to, talking about RFK. A lot of the entrepreneurs that I hang out with, the entrepreneurial community, seems to be very supportive of these non-traditional candidates, right? Like an RFK, like a Vivek Ramaswamy. And even though there's not a lot of policy overlap with guys like that, those two in particular, what I think young people and entrepreneurs like is that they're not necessarily just spewing the same party lines. They're willing to say things and experiment with ideas and concepts and talk about things that the parties themselves don't often want to talk about. So I think from an individual standpoint, you look at guys like Vivek or RFK and you believe that they're actually acting on principle. They're not just promoting policy talking points, right? And then it also happens that these guys have a new strategy. They're going out on these very popular podcasts and they're talking about both policy and principles in great detail over 2 or 3 hours. And so you get a very nuanced understanding of how they get to their points, how they get to where they're at politically and from a policy standpoint, which allows people who are listening to them to buy into what they're proposing versus just short little clips on public TV. So
all right,
I think that type of a movement is going to become more popular, and you can see an outsider candidate having a lot of success.
Yeah, I definitely think that podcasts change the way that people can see people running for office, because effectively you don't have a middleman. You don't have to deal with one of the middlemen on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC who have a preset list of questions tell you and that begin to frame who you are. You can go on and you can talk for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And when people are done, they really gain a more holistic view of who you are. From my standpoint, saves me time. I mean, I'd rather watch somebody for 2 hours once than have to watch them a dozen times trying to figure out who they are in 3-minute clips which really don't give me a good idea of who the candidate is. All right, so Elliot, I want to go back to the housing issue with you. On the housing issue, you've spent a lot of time looking at this and what drives the cost of housing up. Maybe if you can, give us just kind of a brief understanding of that.
Well, it is uniformly accepted, and virtually every study suggests this from the academic world, that regulation has significantly increased the cost of housing. There's no question about that. It's a question of degree. And the studies that seem to me most credible, basically the regulatory cost as a percent of a home price now exceeds 30% at the upper end and exceeds 15% at the lower end. And it's getting worse and worse in that a lot of these regulations basically are unnecessary, either because it's none of the government's business what color you paint your house, or that they are basically micromanaging what a builder is supposed to do. Now, I will tell you that if a builder builds a lousy project, the next project he builds won't sell. So, in effect, it's self-regulating. You'll make a mistake once or twice, but after that, you're out of business. But what has happened is that, again, 30% for the upper quartile, 24% for the average in terms of regulation as a part of the costs. All these things cost money. It takes a longer time. There are now more steps you have to go through. Some of them are not logical. Some of them, I've been in circumstances where you get approved at the city's level, but then when you go on, when an inspector comes out to the site, he will change his mind. He'll say, no, that's not what I want to see. And even if you show him the approval, he basically says, I don't like it. I'm not gonna I'm not going to sign off on it. And he goes away, says back, I'll be back tomorrow or Wednesday or Thursday, whatever it is. But what happens is the people who come to your job site to construct it will be gone for 2 weeks. They're off on another job. And when that job's done, they'll come back. That runs up the cost of building these things. So there simply is a lot of, I'll give you some examples of what drives these costs. In effect, the pure cost of delay is a major one. The cost of applying for zoning and subdivision approval is another one. The cost of incurred before approval, before construction, the land development not built, impact of changes in development standards. That's also a big one. So it's throughout the process where regulations have now become more burdensome in some cities than they otherwise would. Now, we're not California, and Arizona's done a great job of competing. And there are 28 municipalities or so, about 28 municipalities in the greater Phoenix area, and they literally compete against one another. But what happens is when they get to a level, everybody can come in under that level, and that seems to be what's happening. Paul, you might want to discuss when you did a study when your son was building houses about how much time he spent with regulation versus actually building the house. I found that number just astounding. These things add to costs.
Yeah, he literally tracked the amount of time that it took to do the construction, the amount of time that it took for inspectors that would cause delays on projects, oftentimes in disagreement with the city, meaning the city had approved a set of plans and the inspector didn't agree with the approved plan done by the city. And then the amount of time that it took for the city to approve the plan versus the amount of time that it took the architects to draw it. Literally, he could build it and construct it and draw it much faster than the city could approve it and zone it. It was just overwhelming. Now, one of the challenges, because I've been on the city side, is you have a whole set of rules that you have to enforce. You have federal rules that you have to enforce. You have some city rules, some state rules. But the point is, I can promise you, most of the people who are in the city really can't tell you how to get a project through. It's very challenging for them because of the amount of regulations that have been laid on. And then when you get one bad actor, and there's always a bad actor in every organization, boy, they can really gum up your process. What the effect that it has on it is not only it dramatically increases your cost from a time standpoint, but it also dramatically delays the amount of inventory that's in the marketplace. And Elliot, I know you make the point all the time that supply and demand is what really drives the price of housing.
And yes, and right now we're supply short in virtually everything, even though there's going to be a temporary lull in the shortage of multifamily housing. It is short-term in nature. And the reason that you have that shortage is you can't get things through government fast enough. The costs are now to the point where you can't meet the market demand that is created by worker housing, by workforce housing, the stuff that Carson's doing, the stuff that Rob Lyles is doing. You can't do that. And so it's going to be a real problem in terms of getting government across the board to approve certain types of housing that they now don't want in their community, and therefore are using that essentially as a way of pricing out a lot of people from moving to their community.
Governor, were you going to make a comment?
No, I was just going to mention to Elliot's point about supply and demand, that I really think Arizona's in a position, there's all this discussion about, is there going to be a recession? Is there going to be a soft landing? Well, there's always going to be a recession. I mean, there's a business cycle, and these things happen, and they will happen again. I do think Arizona right now, I don't know what the next several months are going to hold, but I think Arizona's in a good position because Americans are voting with their feet. And we do have people coming to our state. And if you remember in the 2010 timeframe, the only reason that then President Obama was able to say that we came out of the recession was because the nation had lost 1.4 million jobs, but Texas had added 1.9 million jobs. So the rest of the country was on life support. Texas was thriving. I think Arizona, with Taiwan Semiconductor and many of the other things that we've been able to accomplish over the last decade, is in a position where, yes, when the business cycle comes down, we'll be able to navigate through it better than others, because we do have this attraction to our state and we have a real economic vitality today.
All right, so I'm going to stick with regulations, but I'm going to move to social media. Social media is a fascinating issue when it comes to regulations, because we passed the Rule 230 decades ago where internet companies, Google and others, were all basically allowed to choose to be a utility as opposed to a publisher. The idea was that that they wouldn't be regulated based upon the content that they placed out into the marketplace. Now, the logic to that was oftentimes they didn't have control over what that content was. They didn't have the ability to review it. But it's created this position where you have a lot of bad information that's going out that has a negative effect on the marketplace. There's a case called Gonzalez versus Google, which was just decided by the Supreme Court, that took a look at this. And their argument was that the companies maybe shouldn't be responsible for all content, but they should be responsible for the content that they're promoting, that they're placing their research engines, or that they're amplifying the information that's going out there. There are really three ways to solve the problem. One is what Europe is doing, which is actually having a committee that reviews the information and the data, which seems very dangerous to me. The second one is to have disclosure of what it is that you're actually promoting. And then the third way is to put them into the same role that you would put any newspaper in, make them responsible for their content. I'd love everybody's comment on this one, because this is an area where, we can either decide to have no regulations or we can become more regulated. Any input on that?
Yeah, so Section 230 was really created the backdrop for the accelerated growth of these social media companies. They couldn't have done it without Section 230, because they would have been treated as publishers, and you can't review, edit, publish that much content at that speed. So it was the accelerant that was needed. I found it interesting. I was just listening to a podcast recently with Matt Taibbi was a guest, who was one of the few journalists given the responsibility to review the Twitter files, right? Having the source access to all the Twitter data. He was one of the publishers entrusted with telling the story. And, he said that he kind of had some expectations of the types of things he was going to find, but what surprised him was what he called a highway of content moderation requests from the federal government, from the FBI, from the NSA. He called it a highway of content moderation requests, meaning it was just an open channel conversation with federal government asking Twitter to moderate. So for me, I think, Twitter being a private company, they can make their rules. They can, and it'll be a competition of the best social media platform is going to win. So if they make bad rules, people are going to flock away from it, right? But when you have a private company doing the bidding of a national government to get around, the First Amendment regulations, that's when it becomes a problem. It starts becoming an entanglement. So I don't know if those are the only three options, Paul, the ones you listed for social media companies, but I think transparency is going to be a big key. Like Twitter wanting to promote their source codes for how things are promoted or depromoted. But I think if people trust that the process is somewhat fair, I think they're going to tolerate some level of confusion or some level of bad discussion on a platform. But right now, I don't feel like that people can trust that the intentions are good or that it's fair. So
yeah, I'm deeply worried about the DSA in Europe, because what they're going to be doing is literally having a committee that will be reviewing content and telling these large companies what they can produce. I think that's going to have a spillover effect on the United States. And of course, I wouldn't mind having the ability to review all the information they were putting it out if I was the arbitrator. But if I'm not going to be the arbitrator, I'm very concerned about somebody else being able to determine what it is that I'm going to be able to have as free speech. Elliot, and then Governor Ducey.
Yeah, the thought of a committee overseeing content is a joke, absolute joke. First of all, how do you do it in real time? You don't. You do it, you basically set some standards that can't be met, and there'll be lawsuits over for years. So to me, that is just a joke. And the fact that the government keeps on basically trying to control content, it now becomes entirely political. So talk about not trusting the government. Now you can't trust anything you read. Now, one of the things I've ended up doing over the years is I got called frequently to be a fact checker. Okay. And the people who do the fact checking are not looking for facts. They're looking for a soundbite that allows them to present something in a positive manner if it's on their side of the aisle, and in a dispositive manner if it's on the other side of the aisle. It's a joke that it's been fact checked. And I believe that this committee will be nothing but a bunch of political hacks that make things a lot worse than better.
I agree. Governor Ducey.
Well, a committee of Europeans over in Brussels regulating the internet. What could go wrong? I mean, it sounds like one of the dumbest ideas in a part of the world which I love and value, but hasn't done a lot for innovation or for new ideas. So I guess I would come at this from a first principles perspective. The thought that a liberal comes across a fence in the middle of the woods and says, "What is that fence doing there? Tear that fence down. It's unsightly." A conservative comes across the same fence and says, "Why is that fence there? Is it necessary?" I do think, this has all happened rather quickly in our lifetime. Our entire world and economy has been transformed by the internet, digital and social media. So I think much of it is good, and it's provided a platform for speech and information and education if you take advantage of it. But it's also caused a lot of complications. So I think that this is something we should be very thoughtful about. I do believe that regulation protects the incumbent. So some of these companies are in a position right now where they have the market and they have the share. I'm not looking to take that away from them. And I do understand people's concerns with this. I'm somebody that always thinks that it's not less speech that we need, it's more speech. And people that were in my former role should be in the persuasion business. And people that believe they have a better idea should make the case for the better idea. And that's why we need to have these open platforms. Yet we can't see much of what's wrong right now. I wonder in many ways the way the law works around defaming someone and what some of these individuals have gone through when they've been piled on or bullied. Seems to me they should have some remedy to that if people participate in that. I'm not speaking about public figures. I'm speaking about other private individuals who have been canceled for whatever reason, or things we could talk about maybe in a future episode. So I do think this is something that needs to be addressed. It's been an innovation that has provided tremendous productivity and convenience to so many folks. But on Section 230 specifically, and what has happened on that side of the equation, I think we can do better. I just don't have any specific policy prescriptions right now. And I think when you get elected leaders and bureaucrats involved, a lot can go wrong. So I think we should be more thoughtful on this and find a way to convene trusted voices that could present several options and actually have a discussion, a public discussion around this so that we improve people's lives rather than try to pick a winner and a loser here. because we do live in a free society, and these are things that we should value, protect, and enhance rather than stamp out.
All right. So, Governor, here's my last question to you today. Both you and Elliot spoke about this, and to me, it's important. You know, I spent time in the Eastern Bloc countries, namely Poland, when the Soviet Union fell. It was so obvious to me the difference between how free markets worked and controlled markets. The controlled markets of the Soviet Union literally had Poland still pulling their cargo into the city on horseback. The water treatment plant was a grate on 8 inches on center with a guy with a pitchfork. There was so much sludge inside the Baltic, you couldn't swim in it, fish in it. You didn't even want to live next to it. It smelled so bad. It was obvious to me that even the salvation for the environment was much more going to be driven by capitalism than it would ever be by socialism or by a controlled market. Now, here's my concern. Inside our schools today, and I'm really speaking at the college level, but there's a lot of talk about postmodernism. There's talk about this whole concept of how power works, that there's an oppressor, there's an oppressed, that the oppressed is in a position that they're in, and the result of that is that we end up having systematic problems, whether, oftentimes they'll call it systematic racism, but usually that's an attack against capitalism. That's really what they're doing. I don't have a problem with that being there, but I'd like to know that they're also being taught the values of free markets so that they can make a comparison. And it seems to me that that's been cut out. I'd love to know if your organization is going to be engaged in that. You talked about trying to educate people. I'd love to know what the Citizens for Free Enterprise will be doing in the educational realm.
Yes, Paul, we are going to be involved in that. We see as education and advocacy as part of this. The umbrella is going to be freedom and free enterprise. And in many ways, the crowning achievement in my last year as governor was that Arizona passed the most universal educational savings account in the nation. This allows a parent to have his child go to the school of their choice, and that's a good thing. But it also means the 1,000 flowers that are going to bloom in coming decades, where we can get out of this oppressor and oppressed, where that's where we're dividing everybody into these two camps, and talk about things like free market economics, our founding documents, an informed American history, warts and all, so that we have an educated citizen that can pursue whatever they like. I mean, what the founders called the pursuit of happiness. So we're going to be doing that. I think part of it is how we do communicate. When you call something free enterprise versus big government socialism, you go from 50-50 to 60-40 or closer to 70-30. I think when we educate people from that Horatio Alger perspective, that they can actually create a business without a lot of capital. I think the show Shark Tank on CNBC has done a lot in a fun way to educate people on how capitalism really does work, and that good ideas can find dollars, and ideas that aren't that thought through are starved of that until they have more of a proof of concept. So we want to be part of all that. I'm very hopeful for where we are. It's a tough time right now, politically and around the globe, but I do think we've been the one place on earth that has been able to refresh and renew and innovate, and Citizens for Free Enterprise intends to be a leading voice for that going forward, and I hope we can continue that conversation on this pod.
I'm sure we will. Carson, looks like you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I love what you just said, Governor Ducey. I find it very effective in terms of persuasion. It works on me, I know. When someone is able to state right on the other side very well, right? That Steelman case, right? So if you're talking about, Governor Ducey, going into a classroom and having something like 50-50, between socialism and capitalism, what are those primary concerns of those people who are talking about socialism, as a good unifying structure for labor? And in those concerns, where is the merit, and how can we acknowledge it while showing how capitalism can overcome that, right? So, like, what are the dangers of free enterprise? Does it have the right amount of regulation, or if it's not done well? and then give a good steelman of that argument, show how we can overcome that versus ignoring the concerns of someone who's more on the socialist side. Because to your point, there's so much evidence that free enterprise is the way to go. And I think on your website, you describe it as the most powerful engine of prosperity, right? In history, which is completely apt. But how do we invite more people over to the other side and to your point, build an army of people who believe in free enterprise and act upon it?
All right, Elliot, now I'm going to let you answer that question, but Elliot, I'm going to throw a new one your way. Actually, I want to throw two your way, and then you can fit in your answer to what Doug was talking about. I'm perplexed on our economy. We have a 4.9% growth rate, which seems to me like that's outstanding. And yet we have record bankruptcies and record foreclosures. I'm interested in number one, how that can be. And number two, the Federal Reserve now is just going out for a new issuance of bonds. I believe it's 120 or $1.2 trillion that they're going to have to try to refinance. I'd like to know what you think, how you think our debt's going to fit into that. So you get the last 3 points.
Okay. Well, let me just start by saying there are two things going on that haven't gone on before when everything else is saying recession. First of all, because of the American Rescue Plan and money left over from COVID, the average the consumers had $2.1 trillion more when this whole thing started, when the recovery started, than they normally have. It's down about $200 billion. So they're spending money they saved or were given, helicopter money from the American Rescue Plan. When they run out of that money, their spending will stop, and it's likely to happen sometime in the first half of 24. Second thing that's happened is baby boomers, mainly over 55, didn't come back to work. Basically, they were getting paid during COVID. They basically, the house went up in value. Their 401k was going up in value. COVID ended. They'd say, shit, I'm done. I'm out of here. And so there's a shortage of labor at a time when business is not willing to let go of labor. So those two things have so far offset everything else that's indicating recession. I do not believe, you might check your stats, bankruptcies are not at an all-time high, nor are foreclosures. They're higher than they were, but they're still lower than they were during other recessions. I think that things change when people start to run out of money and spend less, and that will cause unemployment, so on and so forth. In terms of the federal government, what they're doing is astonishingly brainless. You now have a budget deficit of $2 trillion a year going forward. If we had to finance ourselves out of a crisis again, I'm not sure we could. And the answer is that interest rates are higher than they otherwise would be had the federal government not needed $1.2 trillion in treasuries refinanced. And the thing that's so astonishing to me is during COVID, they could have financed their debt at 50 or even 100 years at basically 1%, and we would have grown our way out of it. But they chose not to, and most of that $5 trillion in debt that they added since COVID started is now short and intermediate term debt. That's just craziness, because when interest on the debt goes up, everything else will be squeezed out. And by the way, interest rates will affect the ability of people to buy cars. The average car on the road is now 12.3 years old, so they're going to need to buy them soon. It's already squeezed people out of housing, which is why Carson's projects look so good right now. Credit card debt will start going through the roof. It's just a matter of time till reality catches up with the consumer. We have a recession, or we have something worse. And it would take a small miracle for us not to have one.
How does government capital compete with private sector capital?
Well, the government pays, the theory with government debt, has a full faith and credit of the U.S. government behind it, which historically has meant it's the safest debt on the planet. So people looking for security are people who are restricted to certain types of debt will end up buying that debt very rapidly. And the reason is they know they're getting their principal back. And there's a protection of principal concept there. And that doesn't exist with corporate debt or even with mortgage debt or any other type of debt. So it's always been easy to sell. If that comes into question, if there's so much debt out there, if you have a government that is out of control in terms of financing, putting more and more debt in, and that comes into question. Will we get our principal back? That's going to be a very dicey situation for the U.S. Right now, we're the prettiest house on an ugly block. If a prettier house is built, we've got issues.
All right. We will be taking up in one of the next episodes the balanced budget or a balanced budget amendment. We hope to have both of you back on that particular episode. Guys, thanks so much. We appreciate you being here with us today. It was a great conversation. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Elliot. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.